Hey there, college football fans. Jack here with another episode of the Big and Bold College Football Show. Today I want to talk about some of these games that were played last weekend. Now, last week I was talking about how I believed it was going to be the best weekend for college football up to that point, and potentially could be for the entire year. And I think it's pretty obvious that it played out that way. It was definitely the best weekend of college football up to this point, and I am very confident in saying that I think it was the best weekend all season. I have a pretty straightforward episode today for you guys. Going to be talking about some of those big games that were played. Have a long list of games. I'm going to just run through them real fast to help signify just how big a weekend it was for college football. And then I'm going to break down 4 of the biggest games from last weekend. So I've got 10 or 11 games I'm going to run through real fast and just knock out how significant this last weekend was and some of the big things going on in college football right now because of last weekend. And then I'm going to break down 4 of the biggest games. So stick around for those. I'm going to give you guys a solid breakdown of 4 big games. And it was tough to pick which games to break down, but ultimately settled it down to 4 for the sake of timing. But let's get right into that list I was talking about. For starters, of course, 17th ranked Ole Miss taking down 13th ranked Arkansas, 52-51. That game was insane. That's a game I'm going to be breaking down in today's episode. 6th ranked Oklahoma playing 21st ranked Texas. Red River Showdown in Dallas, Texas. Oklahoma's down 28-7. Next thing you know, Caleb Wilson, freshman, 5-star out of high school, takes over at quarterback and leads them to a 55-48 victory in the largest comeback in the history of the Red River Showdown. Virginia-Louisville, surprisingly good game there. Not a whole lot of people watched that game, but Virginia pulled that one off 34-33. There was a close 1-point game. 19th ranked Wake Forest had to fight their way back to win 40-37 against Syracuse. Boise State upset a 10th ranked BYU team. BYU's having a phenomenal year. They had a great year last year, and Boise State pulled off the upset 26-17. 3rd ranked Iowa, of course, that was the best game of the week, played 4th ranked Penn State. Took them down 23-20 in a very close competitive game that saw Sean Clifford get knocked out of that matchup. There's another game I'll be talking about. Notre Dame had to win it by a field goal. 14th ranked Notre Dame beat Virginia Tech 32-29. But Notre Dame won the game. Another close one, but they ended up pulling it off. 16th ranked Kentucky beat LSU 42-21. They are off to their best start since Bear Bryant was with the program. So it's been over 60, 70 years since Kentucky's been off to this good a start to their season. 9th ranked Michigan took down Nebraska by 3 points with a field goal at the end, 32-29. That was a close game. I have a full breakdown of that on the channel as well if you're interested in watching that content. Utah went to USC into their backyard and stomped them 42-26. That's pretty significant considering Utah does not do well on the road at USC. But with the recent firing of Clay Helton, I felt like Utah had a good shot and they pulled the game off. And then, of course, final game I'm going to be breaking down today. Texas A&M, an unranked Texas A&M team, mind you, no longer the top 10 team coming into the season, beat number 1 Alabama 41-38. Now, last week I talked about how I felt like Alabama was going to suffer that loss. It did not seem likely to me that they were going to go undefeated again this year. But I wasn't sure where that loss was going to happen. I started looking down the road to the Auburn matchup, a couple other sneaky games on their schedule. But right below our noses, Texas A&M pulled off the upset with a field goal at the end of the game. Avoided overtime and won that matchup. So phenomenal job by A&M there. So that is just a long list of most of the big games that were played. Don't get me wrong, I could probably talk more about, the Georgia-Auburn matchup where, 2nd-ranked Georgia just outmatched Auburn. Talk about Florida State smacking down North Carolina in a pretty surprising loss for North Carolina. So a lot of great games. SMU survived against Navy 31-24. A lot of really good games were played. And this was by far the best weekend, in my opinion, up to this point. And I think it will be all year. And then as it pertains to the AP poll, I talked about there were some significant changes because of this weekend. For one thing, we have a new king of college football this season. It's Georgia. They're the number one team in the country, sitting at 6-0. Iowa was able to go up to the second-ranked team in the country. Cincinnati, surprisingly enough, is currently viewed as a playoff team. They're the third-ranked team in the country right now. Oklahoma managed to pull off that fourth-ranked spot. Don't know if they deserve it, but they're the fourth-ranked team in the country, and I understand it. They're 6-0. Really, the biggest thing to talk about, the Big Ten has 5 teams in the top 10. That is the first time a single conference has had 5 teams in the top 10 at one time. That's 10th-ranked Michigan State, 8th-ranked Michigan, 7th-ranked Penn State, 6th-ranked Ohio State, and 2nd-ranked Iowa. That's pretty insane. Not to mention, Kentucky, they moved up to 11th, so Kentucky's about to become a top 10 team. Granted, they got to play Georgia this weekend, but that's a conversation for another time. Oklahoma State, borderline top 10 team there. Notre Dame proved their worth as a top 15 program. San Diego State's all the way up to 24th. I mean, the top 25 is crazy right now, especially the top 10. Nobody really knows how to make sense of it because no matter how you shuffle it, it's not going to be perfect. When is it ever, right? But especially this year, it's so hard to put your finger on who should be ranked where. But with that said, that's the current status of the AP poll and just a little overview of some of the crazy games that were played. So now I have 4 games I want to talk about. Let's start with the best game of the weekend. Now, I anticipated in the offseason that this was going to be Alabama-Texas A&M, but it didn't really work out that way leading up to this past weekend, although when you look at how it went, I mean, Alabama being unseeded by A&M certainly ended up being probably the game of the weekend, but Penn State and Iowa had some pretty serious playoff implications. You know, even with Alabama losing, they're still a solid lock to make the playoff. But when it comes to Penn State, they're definitely hurting because of this loss. And as for Iowa, they just got past the biggest hump on their schedule. So let's talk about the game a little bit. If you wanted a defensive battle, you got it. You know, this is pretty iconic Big Ten football right here. Not a lot of offense, unfortunately. So if you're a fan of offense, this was not a game for you. But you look at how the game played out. Penn State was up 17-3. Sean Clifford took them down the field to get Noah Cain into the end zone. Clifford himself had a rushing touchdown. And the offense was moving. And Sean Clifford threw 2 interceptions. Problem for Iowa is they only had 3 points off of those 2 turnovers. So they're down 17-3, but Sean Clifford gets knocked out of the game with, I believe, a shoulder injury. And Taquan Robertson has to step in and play quarterback for the Nittany Lions. Now, of course, you could say if Sean Clifford doesn't get injured, the offense keeps rolling, Iowa doesn't bounce back, and Penn State is the top 4 team. Probably they would themselves be the second-ranked team in the country at that point. And that's valid. I do understand that logic. But Sean Clifford did get hurt. And Taquan Robertson did step in. And that was some of the worst quarterback play I've seen from a backup in a long time in a big game like that. You know, I'll compare it to, say, Michigan or Ohio State. Those quarterback rooms, if Cade McNamara or C.J. Stroud come out of the game, I'm confident in their backup quarterback to step in. Just to give you a reference to a couple of other Big Ten teams. Penn State, Taquan Robertson played a pretty terrible game. He was 7 for 21 for 34 yards. He himself had 2 interceptions as well. But the problem is that the offense went to an absolute sputter from that point on. And Penn State just wasn't able to move the football whatsoever. The Iowa punting game was very good. They were able to pin Penn State within their own 20 on a few different occasions. And they had no chance of moving the football. Not to mention, one thing to talk about that isn't so much on the quarterback, but they were pretty heavily penalized as well. They had 10 penalties in the game. Granted, it was only for 59 yards, but when you have over double the amount of penalties as the opposing team, and you throw 4 interceptions, yeah, I'm not entirely surprised that they lost that football game, and they lost the time of possession battle. And we keep talking about Iowa like, you know, we can't expect these turnovers to continue. But this is the second year in a row now they've led the country in interceptions, or I should say turnovers. So maybe that, you know, you have to expect that when you play Iowa, they're going to get the ball from you a couple times. Now, don't get me wrong, they don't have the offense of a playoff team. Sean Clifford did, however, have two touchdowns on the game. Tyler Goodson had a subpar performance running for them. But it doesn't really matter because they're going to be the favorite in every game the rest of the year. You know, when you looked at their schedule, you said they had to beat Indiana, Iowa State, Penn State, and Wisconsin. That was their most substantial games in their first 8 weeks. After that, it's Northwestern, Minnesota, Illinois, Nebraska. Well, they got past a 4th-ranked Penn State. They took down a 9th-ranked Iowa State and a 17th-ranked Indiana. Now, Indiana's not having the year that we thought they would, but week 1 of the year, we thought they were good. Iowa State, kind of a similar story, but still a quality, competitive program. And then Penn State was the 4th-ranked team in the country, like I said. So really, when I look at it, Wisconsin's not the team we thought they were going to be this year. Neither is Northwestern. Their biggest contest could be their last game of the season at Nebraska. And Nebraska has lost 3 competitive games. And if you think Adrian Martinez has had a lot of turnovers already this year, and they've made a lot of mistakes, just wait until they play Iowa at the end of the season. But that is most certainly a potential trap game for the Hawkeyes. So that's kind of my biggest takeaway is that, yeah, they don't have the best offense, but they don't need it. And if they play the Buckeyes or Penn State again at the end of the season, it might not matter if they don't have the best offense in college football anyway, because their defense is second to only Georgia at this point. And Georgia's defense is front 7 happy. Iowa's is back 7 happy. So there's kind of the difference between those two. But that's kind of my takeaway from that game. Good win for Iowa and almost an unfortunate loss for Penn State. It looked like they could have most certainly won that game if Sean Clifford doesn't go down. But it's up to that coaching staff to make sure you have a contingency plan if he goes down, and they did not. So up next, wildest game of the weekend. I watched a lot of this game. Turned it off because it looked like Oklahoma was screwed and I made the wrong pick in this game. Next thing I know, about 45 minutes later, hour later, I flip the game back on and I see that Caleb Williams is in the game and leading them on a comeback against Texas. But with a little more context, obviously Oklahoma goes down 28-7 after the first quarter. Absolutely embarrassing performance to them. Good job on Texas though, for getting up like they did. They showed some elite offensive ability in this game to be able to take down a team like Oklahoma. A lot of it was an interception here from Spencer Rattler, a mistake in coverage and a missed tackle there, this and that. And next thing you know, you're down 28-7. Xavier Worthy had an incredible game as a freshman. And yes, I am still very salty by the fact that he was committed to Michigan and for one reason or another was ineligible to enroll or play for the program. But Xavier Worthy had 9 catches, 260 yards, and 2 touchdowns, guys. That is a freshman wide receiver with elite speed. He looks like a 4.3 guy already. Elite speed at wide receiver. Bijan Robinson, he ripped off a couple big runs, including a 50-yard run at one point as well. So phenomenal performance by him. And Casey Thompson looked legit, and over the course of the game, he threw 5 touchdowns. But that's going to be where the good news ends for Texas. I wanted to talk about some of the positives there, but now I kind of have to get into the negatives, unfortunately. And unfortunately, the negatives are that you allowed a freshman quarterback to step in over Spencer Rattler. And Rattler, not the only issue for Oklahoma at this point. Caleb Wilson comes in, Spencer Rattler gets benched, Caleb Williams comes in, and leads them to victory in this game. When you look at Rattler's stat line of 8 for 15, 111 yards, no touchdowns and an interception, granted, he did have a rushing touchdown on the game. And then Caleb Williams comes in, he's 16 for 25, 212 yards and 2 touchdowns. He also had a 66-yard carry in the game, 88 yards and a touchdown overall on the ground. He most definitely led them all the way in this victory over Texas. In the second quarter, you saw it developing. They had a couple scores on the ground, had the Caleb Williams run, had a couple field goals for Oklahoma. But, Texas themselves had another touchdown from Casey Thompson. But Oklahoma kept at it. Third quarter rolls around. Another touchdown from Caleb Williams. They keep Texas to just a field goal in the third quarter. Now it's anybody's game. It's 33-41, start of the fourth quarter. Who's going to win this matchup? And they get down the field, and Caleb Williams scores the touchdown for them. Gets it to Marvin Mims on a 52-yard touchdown pass. 2-point conversion. Now it's a 41-41 ball game. Next thing you know, Kennedy Brooks rips off a touchdown, 48-41. Now, when Texas scored the Xavier Worthy touchdown, I was a little concerned there. It's a 48-48 game. Wasn't sure if Oklahoma was going to be able to continue getting down the field. I thought it was going to go into overtime. But here's where I go from my praise of Caleb Williams in his stellar performance as a freshman to Kennedy Brooks. Kennedy Brooks scored the game-winning touchdown for them. I believe it was a 30-yard run to score and take down Texas. He ended the game with 217 yards and 2 touchdowns. So if you're going to credit Caleb Williams, give some credit to Kennedy Brooks as well, because he had a phenomenal performance in this game. I was shocked by the amount of points scored. I thought, when I previewed this game, I had Nick Benito, edge rusher for Oklahoma, being my key player of the game. And he did have a fantastic game. 1.5 sacks, 5 tackles. Good performance by him, but Kennedy Brooks ended up being, I think, the X factor in this. If you want to look at Caleb Williams' performance and say, what was it that really iced the cake for them? I think it was Kennedy Brooks. He had a phenomenal game. Let's move on to that next matchup I wanted to talk about. Moving on to the Arkansas-Ole Miss game. This was a surprisingly good matchup, and I did not see this many points being scored. I had Ole Miss winning, but I did not expect Arkansas to put the fight up that they did. And it was a back-and-forth battle. Multiple lead changes in the game, leading up to a phenomenal fourth quarter where Ole Miss takes a touchdown lead, Arkansas ties it. Ole Miss takes a touchdown lead, Arkansas ties it. Ole Miss takes a touchdown lead, and Arkansas ties it. So at this point, Arkansas has had to respond to touchdown after touchdown in the fourth quarter. And really, that started at the end of the third quarter as well, after the game was tied 24-24. So I really understand that Arkansas wanted to win the game, and they went for 2. And I don't think it was so much the play call, it was the execution that ended up hurting them in their attempt to steal that game there at the end with the 2-point conversion. But ultimately, KJ Jefferson, quarterback for Arkansas, has really won my attention. He had an incredible game, put the team on his back for 6 touchdowns. That's phenomenal. 0 run defense for either team, though, if I were to have a knack on Arkansas and Ole Miss. Arkansas racked up 350 yards and 4 touchdowns on the ground. Ole Miss had 324 and 5 touchdowns on the ground. Matt Corral himself had 4 touchdowns on the game as a whole. He had a phenomenal performance, put together some fantastic throws in the second half to ice this one for Ole Miss. Really just an incredible game and a very fun one to watch. If you're not a fan of, watching offenses just go back and forth, then this wasn't a good one for you. Just like if you're, a fan of defense, that was great for you in the Penn State game, in the Penn State Iowa game. If you like offense, that wasn't it. But this was all offense in this game. So phenomenal job there. And I'm not sure what to make of Ole Miss. I had them as the most overrated team in college football. I think people were looking at their established quarterback, something that not a whole lot of teams in college football have this year, and said, yeah, they're a top 10 team or borderline top 10 team. But I have a lot more respect for them this week than I did last week before this game was played. Watching Matt Corral battle back and forth and Lane Kiffin calling up those plays was a good job. I think their defense is putrid. Arkansas's defense, I was shocked by how poorly they defended the run. I think if their run defense was a little stronger, Matt Corral did not have as strong a performance through the air as I thought he would. But this looks like 21st century Arkansas. They had KJ Jefferson make some big throws he needed to make for them to stay in this football game because they can't do it all on the ground. But ultimately, a very good game. Still don't know what I think of Arkansas or Ole Miss. But no matter what, Arkansas is off to a better start than anybody thought they would. And good for Ole Miss being beating a legit team in the form of Arkansas. Finally, we've got a huge upset here that occurred. First-ranked Alabama took on Texas A&M on the road and lost 38-31. Alabama no longer the number one team in the country. Now, I'm not going to spend too long on this, but it wasn't Bryce Young that lost them the game or the Alabama run game. Their defense played poorly in truth. They had zero ability to get to the quarterback. And it really wasn't even the A&M defense that won them this game, or even their run game. It was Zach Calzada. And that's where I'm going to focus right now. He had 285 yards and 3 touchdowns in this matchup. And without Zach Calzada having as good a game as he did, and they got some good stops by the defense when they needed him, they don't win this game. They got down the field at the end of the fourth quarter and scored that game-winning field goal in very dramatic fashion. And this was really just a fantastic win for Texas A&M. And I think it was a morale booster for a program that, after Haynes King went down with injury to start the year, and then they struggle against Colorado, they lose to Arkansas, their season sort of went into limbo of what they are and what they think they can be. But Zach Calzada just got the biggest win of his career. And at Texas A&M, I'm thinking this is Jimbo Fisher's biggest win of his career at Texas A&M. I mean, beating the number one team in the country is not something that happens every day. And that was a great job by A&M to pull it off in a gritty game. I still think Bryce Young is the favorite for the Heisman. You know, he had 3 touchdowns on the game, over 360 yards. Did throw an interception, but that can be forgivable. Alabama can still make the playoff, though. That's still in question for them. The problem is going to be that SEC championship game. I don't doubt Alabama wins out the rest of the season, but they're going to have a matchup with Georgia where I'm looking into my crystal ball here and looking forward and imagining a scenario where an undefeated Georgia, which I had predicted in the offseason, that an undefeated Georgia makes it to the SEC championship game, loses to Alabama, Alabama being a one-loss team with this loss to A&M, and then you're going to have that rematch in the playoff, or depending on how the seeding goes, you know, it could be in the championship if both those teams make it, but it's entirely possible that occurs. But like I said, Georgia's got to keep their nose clean the rest of the season. That SEC championship game, if they're undefeated, is not a must-win for them to be a playoff team, but obviously they want an SEC championship. And as for Alabama, they can't lose another game. They lose another game, no matter where it's at. You're talking about Bama as a New Year's 6 competitor, but not as a playoff competitor this year. And that's not the end of the world. They won a national championship last year, and like 5 others before that with Nick Saban. So if they don't make the playoff, it's not the end of the world. Clemson is 1.5 miles away from the playoff this year. It happens. So let's not overblow this loss for Alabama. They're going to be the favorite the rest of the season, though. So if they do lose a game, it's going to be by way of upset, and I can't predict where that's going to occur or if it will even occur. But I imagine that they're getting at it in practice, trying to make up for the mistakes they had in this game and trying to sew up their defense, which to me is really where they're going to have to improve. I mean, I don't know if they had a single sack in the game, had the 1 interception on Calzada. But like I said, this is really more for Texas A&M in my mind. When you beat the number one team in the country, especially ending the insane streak of over like 120 wins against unranked opponents that Nick Saban has, it just further adds to that flame of the fact that this is the craziest year we've had in college football in a long time. And I'm all here. I'm all for it. I love it because last year sucked. Last year's college football season was not a legitimate college football season. I'm not saying wipe the records or this and that, but it just wasn't the same. This year is a fantastic year for college football, and it's a damn shame that we are halfway through it already. But with that said, thank you for listening to the video, everybody. I had to push something out talking about the insanity from this past weekend. Those were my favorite games. Those were the games I was able to watch from the weekend. Not to mention the Michigan game, of course. That's a weekly thing for me. So thank you for checking out the video, guys. I really love pushing out content. If you're here at the end of the video listening, please like and subscribe. That's all I ask. It's a very new channel, and I love creating content for people. even if I don't have a million listeners, right? But at the end of the day, again, thank you for listening, guys. I'm going to push out another video talking about the upcoming weekend. Ideally, I'm going to try to push something out. This isn't the best weekend for college football. Granted, you never know how big a weekend can be until it's played. So with that, thanks, everybody.